You're listening to ARC. In the brutal heat of the Kalahari summer, an ox wagon is headed towards the small town of Rietfontein. It is 1908 and Rietfontein is a tiny town far away from, well, almost everything. But it's also the border between two vast colonial empires. On the one side of town is German Southwest Africa, and on the other side is the British Cape Colony. On top of the wagon is a man in riding pants, a felt hat, and the kind of mustache you'd draw on a colonial-era scientist in a cartoon. And that's what he is, not a cartoon character, but a scientist. His name is Rudolf Pöch, and he's an Austrian anthropologist in the Kalahari on a mission. He's there to collect. And 2 years later, when he returns to Austria, he's taken 2,000 photographs, film footage, sound recordings, 1,500 objects, and bones from 171 human beings. My name is Rasmus Spitz, and you're listening to the Unburied Podcast, a history show about the strange connections across time and space that continue to shape our world. This season is about the man on top of the wagon, Rudolf Pöch, and what he did in the Kalahari. But we didn't set out to make a story about Pöch. When we first began researching this story, I didn't know anything about him. It started because I learned that at our local museum, the Iziko South African Museum in Cape Town, there was a room full of human skeletons. Literally more than 1,000, packed into cardboard boxes. The person who told me about the skeletons was one of the managers at the museum, Dr. Wendy Black. She wanted to rebury them, at least some of them. The skeletons that she believed had been stolen and used for race science, a discredited scientific discipline that was used to justify white supremacy. Dr. Wendy Black has been engaging with the communities these bones were stolen from for years. And she wanted someone to tell this story. The point was, she said, to document the difficult process of repair and reburial. Because the process isn't just about bones. It's about racism.
It's not easy. It's really not easy. It's horrible. It's difficult.
It's about generational trauma.
These bones has been sleeping, rattling in the boxes for centuries.
But it's also about building a better future.
Time has come for us to be healed.
So while you're hearing this, we are following the efforts to rebury the bones. And that story you'll get later. But during the research for this, I encountered the man on the ox wagon, Dr. Rudolf Pöch. And I realized that it was him who began digging up bones in the Kalahari, or unburying them, as some say. And I realized that if you understand him and why he took bones from more than 170 people in the Kalahari, you're better equipped to understand not just the past, but also the world we live in now. So this is a kind of a prequel in 4 episodes. The story of Rudolf Pöch's Kalahari expedition. This is episode 1, Humans on Display. Today, the border still runs through the desert in an entirely straight line for more than 400 kilometers, like it has done since it was drawn on a map in 1890. The border is straight and static, but the red dunes it cuts across are always moving. Rietfontein is still a border town, but the empires on either side are long gone. Today it's a minor crossing between Namibia and South Africa, where I'm looking for traces of Rudolf Pöch in November 2024. It's Sunday morning and Willie Philander is about to go home after church when he sees me wandering around town with a microphone and offers his help.
Morning. Is this the old German church or?
No. That's the Lutheran church.
Yeah.
What I really want to know is if the people in Rietfontein have heard about Rudolf Pöch and his travels through the region.
So I'm on a little bit of a historical research kind of trip, and it's a kind of a long story, but it's about this Austrian.
While the church bell tolls in the background, Willie tells me about Rietfontein, and I tell him about Pöch. It's still early in my research, so there's a lot I don't know yet. But I do know that Rudolf Pöch had a distinguished scientific career that really took off after his expedition to the Kalahari. And in this dry part of the world he knew little about, he went to great length to get hold of skulls, bones, and whole human skeletons. He would dig up graves, sometimes the graves of people who died very recently. He would light a massive fire. He'd heat up water and boil the bodies of recently deceased people to clean the bones before shipping them to Austria. Sometimes close family members would find out. They would grieve, they would complain, but it didn't matter. Pöch kept going.
So he collected the bones here in this area and took it where to? To Germany or where to?
To Austria, yeah.
In Austria, Rudolf Pöch is still famous. But here, nobody I speak to has heard about it.
That's not something very good to hear, and it will be good to know all these things. It is history. It is our history, and our history can't be buried. We have to know about it.
The bones from the area around Rietfontein are just the beginning. But before we go back in time to follow in the footsteps of Rudolf Pöch, you need a little context. When Dr. Rudolf Pöch came to Rietfontein in 1908, he was convinced that the people whose artifacts, languages and bones he was going to collect were dying out. Especially the San, or the Bushmen as he called them. But they didn't die out, and they still haven't, not at all. And here we need to make a note. Most of this story is about a diverse group of people who go by many names. Some prefer the mostly officially used San, which describes the indigenous recent hunter-gatherers of southern Africa. Some prefer Khoisan, a term that includes the indigenous pastoralists, the Khoi as well. But some again prefer the term Bushman, which by others is still considered derogatory. In fact, almost everyone we've spoken to for this podcast prefers to be called Bushman. The thing is, all names that describe the San or the Bushman collectively are exonyms. They are given to them by others. And in this podcast, we'll try our best to use whatever term people themselves prefer. So you'll hear names like San, Bushman, Gomani, Nama, Am, Griqua, Korana, and others. And if it sounds complicated, well, that's because it is. While the Bushmen as a group perhaps is one of the most studied peoples in the world, they've often been deprived of complexity. Even today, they are kind of stuck in the public imagination as primitive skin-clad hunter-gatherers roaming the desert. A modern-day bushman is not just one thing. Some do wear animal skins sometimes and hunt in the desert, but others write reports and work in offices. And for some, there's no contradiction between living deeply in the 21st century while at the same time embracing culture and tradition. Take Brian, for example.
My name is Brian Mienies. I am the assistant to the traditional leader of the Komani, son of Peter's Falboy.
Aside from being the assistant to the leader of the Komani of the southern Kalahari, Brian Mienies is an activist in his own right. He's young, he's well-spoken, he's dressed in cargo shorts, a polo shirt and a khaki-colored bucket hat. Brian represents the Komani San, but he's also part of a larger group of indigenous peoples who reject being put into a single category.
We have so much in common, but yet there's so much diversity. We have the same struggles. The Namas, the Griquas, everybody else. We've been having the same struggle.
And this common struggle Brian talks about isn't just some abstract concept. It's deeply personal.
My family was brutally even murdered, slaughtered by the apartheid regime, by the British, by those past regimes.
Like most others in Rietfontein, Brian Mienies hasn't heard about the Austrian anthropologist that arrived here in 1907. But he isn't exactly surprised either.
Well, what I can say is it brings about emotion because it's my people, it's my ancestors. Some have built their lives and their whole existence on the suffering of my people.
Rudolf Pöch grew up in Vienna towards the end of the 19th century. At the time, it was the capital city of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, still then a European powerhouse.
Actually, the third biggest empire in Europe at the time.
This is Dr. Walter Sauer, retired professor of history at the University of Vienna. Aside from his professional interest in colonial history, Sauer has had a lifelong connection to South Africa.
I was decades ago an activist and later the chair of the Austrian anti-apartheid movement. And that is where my attachment to South Africa's come from, or the attachment to the new South Africa, I should say.
And this personal connection will become important in a later episode of this podcast. But for now, let's stay in Vienna in the late 1800s. At the time, the first city of a vast empire.
I mean, the geographical dimensions were huge. 50 million is not bad. And part of it was well developed.
At this point, the empire is beginning to come apart at the seams. But Vienna is still the beating heart of Central Europe.
In terms of culture, arts and culture, you have these important philosophers. You had Sigmund Freud. You had this Klimt, the famous painters. Maybe it was a facade, but that facade was really world class, actually.
This is the famous Vienna, a city of art and culture with a celebrated past where you can eat pastries named after Mozart while walking along streets named after Mahler, Klimt or Beethoven. Or, indeed, Dr. Rudolf Pöch.
There is also a street named after Rudolf Pöch in Vienna, right? Have you been there?
No, I've never been. I never went. Yeah.
This is Sophie Schasiepen, PhD in history from the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. She wrote her thesis on Rudolf Pöch, and these days she lives in Vienna, quite far from the street named after Pöch, and even further from the Kalahari. Sophie's research might be the most comprehensive done on Rudolf Pöch's travels in the Kalahari. But Sophie first introduces him not as a distinguished professor, but as a 16-year-old boy. It's late winter in 1878, and Rudolf Pöch is in Kärtnerstraße in the center of Vienna. He's probably excited as he waits to attend an exhibition with his mother. He must be, because decades later he remembers the scene in such detail that he's able to draw a map of the display from memory. This isn't an exhibition by one of those famous Austrians that the country still celebrates. It's probably an exhibition that most people would rather pretend never happened. It's a so-called Völkerschau, a people show. or, as some have described them, a human zoo. It's a minor exhibition, at the time described as a display of 3 man-eaters from Australia. How the people on display felt about this description, or the fact that they were on display in the first place, was never recorded. But on the young Pöch, the show made a deep impression, but not because it was particularly unique.
Firstly, the fact that he went as a teenager with his mother to see this exhibition, so that this was an accepted and integrated form of entertainment of the kind of bourgeois, section of the city.
In Europe as a whole, exhibitions of people from across the world happened all the time. In cities like Berlin, Paris, London, and Vienna, almost every year, people from Africa, Oceania, or Asia were put on display for entertainment. Smaller towns were visited by traveling exhibitions, and human zoos were part of many world fairs, for example in Chicago and Paris. And the little performance in Kärtnerstraße was probably not the only one that Pöch attended.
One can assume that Pöch went to see quite a few of these exhibitions.
Sophie includes this because Pöch mentions the show in a letter from his first major expedition to Papua New Guinea and Australia decades later.
And so he writes that letter to his mother and is trying to explain to her what he saw in the colony, and is really making that reference for her to try to understand what he's experiencing.
In the letter he writes, "You still remember we once saw Australian bush people in the porch behind Kärtnerstraße. There are only a few left here. They're dying out. I've already taken many pictures and also measurements from some."
And I just thought that was such a fascinating example of how, I don't even know how to really say it, but how delusional all these concepts are, that he's there in that supposedly real situation. But he feels that it helps him to make his mother understand what he's seeing, to make her remember that situation of this Völkerschau. Yeah.
So basically that even when he goes to the other side of the world and on a scientific mission, what he experiences is still kind of his imagination.
Absolutely.
That is closer to, what he experienced as a teenager, his fantasy about all these like different people or whatever it is. Like,
exactly.
Yeah.
The point I'm trying to make is that even when Pöch travels across the world to study people and culture, he doesn't arrive as a blank slate. He's the product of a culture that has put people of color on display for entertainment for a century. People and cultures that, according to researchers like Pöch, are going extinct. And therefore they need to be preserved, but not as living people and living cultures, as objects in museums. There were millions of Europeans who attended exhibitions where people were on display during the 1800s. Very few of them became anthropologists. But Rudolf Pöch did, and he was in the service of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, not a major colonial power like Britain, France, or even Germany. So how did he end up in the Kalahari? Here's Professor Walter Sauer.
There was a division of labor. The British or the French, they were the ones who established colonies successfully and so on. But then they needed a lot of preparatory work, exploration, drawing maps, establishing traffic connections, geological research, agricultural research. And in this field, Austria and Austria-Hungary actually was very strong. And this is where now Mr. Pöch comes in.
The Austrians he was working for had mostly given up on establishing large colonies like the British or the French. But that did not mean they'd given up on the colonial project.
Well, they wanted to to participate in the international scientific competition.
Science was one of the battlegrounds in the competition between empires. And a very important scientific field was the study of human evolution.
Can we find the great formula, so the how life functions?
At the time, solving the great puzzle of evolution was seen not just as a question of knowledge of the past, but also of power in the future.
Those who would find the formula, then they would actually be on the way to world domination.
And solving the puzzle was only possible for those who held all the pieces.
They did a lot of collecting ethnographic objects or agricultural specimen, also human remains.
From this point of view, the world was a hunting ground. And people like Rudolf Pöch were very important in the race to capture as much as possible, while there was still anything left to take.
He had a lot of money available from the Academy of Science, and he wanted to raise research on people or ethnic groups who were regarded of dying out.
And the most important pieces of this puzzle were the bodies of human beings, especially the bodies of indigenous peoples, like the Bushmen. But the empires that needed the bodies of the Bushmen were at the same time killing them and making their lifestyle impossible. So Pöch needed to hurry.
Now is the time we have now to do the research, because in 20 years, 50 years, these people will be extinct. And so we miss an important component of how human race developed. And that was the idea.
But the Nazis had left a terrible legacy. When they saw the German concentration camps...
When World War II ended in 1945 in Europe, pictures from the Nazi death camps shocked the world.
The Allied soldiers are horrified as they open the gates.
Images of emaciated survivors and mass graves directly inspired the Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention in 1948. But these were not the first pictures of German death camps. Eerily similar pictures were taken in German Southwest Africa 40 years earlier. In a terrible foreshadowing of what was to come, German forces built concentration camps across what today is Namibia and killed Nama and Herero people on an industrial scale. The terrible pictures of the death camps in Namibia never reached a global audience, and they didn't lead to any declarations of human rights. The genocide became a largely forgotten tragedy. Or maybe suppressed is a better word, because anyone who was there knew exactly what was going on. For example, Rudolf Pöch. When he arrived in German Southwest Africa in 1907, the land was still a killing field. And we know he believed entire peoples would disappear. But for him, the tragedy was an opportunity. Here's researcher Sophie Schasiepen again.
Pöch arrives in a time where he still benefits even, from the perspective of an anthropologist from those battlefields. He manages to, or I actually don't want to use these kind of words, but he gets some remains of people who died as a consequence of that genocide, of those battles.
When Rudolf Pöch sits on top of his wagon, steadily moving across the dry Kalahari plains, he embodies the idea of the lone anthropologist, the courageous explorer who travels into unknown territory in pursuit of knowledge. Of course, the territory isn't really unknown, not even to Rudolf Pöch, and he isn't really alone either. He's not the person driving the wagon, setting up the cot and the tent, translating the local languages, or even digging up the graves. All along the way, Rudolf Pöch is aided by a number of people hired to do the heavy lifting. Most of them locals, several of them the very Bushmen he is planning to study. All that remain in the archive is the perspective of one man, Dr. Rudolf Pöch. There are no streets named after any of them. In fact, they mostly disappear in the records altogether. And as you know, even he isn't widely known about in the Kalahari of today. But people like community activist Mienies, whom you met in the beginning of this podcast, know what type of man he is.
What we've been telling ourselves in the Kalahari is that there's many anthropologists that have came in the past, and they've been telling our story from their view.
Remember the question I asked in the beginning? Why did Rudolf Pöch collect the bones of more than 170 people in the Kalahari? At the time, Pöch said he needed the bones for research. They needed to be studied to add another piece to the puzzle of human evolution, before it was too late and the Bushmen would have disappeared. This is one of those stories that Brian mentions, stories told from the anthropologist perspective. We do know now that this was only part of the reason. The science of the era had other motives, like Professor Walter Sauer said.
Can we find the great formula, so the how life functions? And those who would find the formula, then they would actually be on the way to world domination.
And just to be clear, the science produced by Pöch and people like him at the time was wrong. So-called race science that later was completely disproven. The research was misguided and the theories utterly wrong. By then, however, the bad science had already contributed to some of the most deadly political ideologies in the 20th century.
Our policy is one which is called by an Afrikaans word apartheid. Mein Lebenskampf ist nicht umsonst gekämpft.
And those connections will continue to unravel in the next episodes. We'll follow Rudolf Pöch on the wagon into the Kalahari. And maybe there is actually another perspective on what happened here than his. Because amongst the measuring kits, the tents, the cots, and all the other stuff he had on the wagon, there were two of the very first examples of field recorders. Gramophone-like devices with huge funnels that record by cutting grooves in cylinders made from wax or old-style records. Recordings of a very low quality by today's standards, but nevertheless recordings that do exist. And hidden in the grooves in the wax are other voices than the voice of the anthropologist. You've been listening to the Unburied Podcast, a production by ARC in partnership with the Iziko Museums of South Africa. The series is produced, written and sound designed by myself and Neil Liddell, with support from Dane Dotz, Naime Malaika, Brian Mienies, Neil Rush, and most of all, the archaeology unit at the Iziko South African Museum in Cape Town. This story is made possible by listeners like you. To get access to bonus content and, frankly, make this work possible at all, support us by becoming an ARC Angel. Click on the link in the show notes or go to arcdocs.org. My name is Rasmus Spitz, and if you like what you hear, please share it with the people you like.